On May 30th, the President of the United States announced that negotiations with the European Union had stalled. Just hours later, he imposed a sweeping 50% tariff on all European imports: cars, aluminum, electronics, farm goods, and more. Markets reacted instantly. European stocks slid more than 2%. A once nearly finalized €43 billion aircraft deal was suddenly frozen. Bloomberg warned that if Europe retaliates, U.S. trade losses could top $2 trillion over the next decade. What was intended as leverage is quickly turning into a self-inflicted hit. Brussels struck back immediately. The European Commission rolled out a new round of countermeasures, covering $95 billion in U.S. exports. But the quieter move was far more impactful: steps to suspend Boeing's massive orders. Ryanair's $30 billion commitment for 737 MAX jets is now under review. Delivery delays and tariff-driven price hikes of up to 14% forced Ryanair's leadership to reconsider every purchase. Airbus shares surged more than 3% in Frankfurt. Adding even more disruption, China's COMAC entered the picture. For the first time, European airlines are modeling fleet plans without a single U.S. aircraft in the mix. This is no longer just an economic blow, it's a credibility crisis. Already facing supply chain troubles and investor doubts, Boeing now risks losing its position in Europe altogether. If Ryanair shifts to COMAC, it would be historic: the first European airline to pick Chinese jets over American ones. The fallout wouldn't stop at Boeing's revenue, it would shake the Federal Aviation Administration's authority. For decades, U.S. standards have been the global benchmark in aviation. A COMAC breakthrough could fragment that dominance and reshape flight certification worldwide. Airbus may win for now, but the long game has more players and new rules. Europe's tariffs hit America where it stings politically. Motorcycles, denim, peanut butter, exports tied to swing states and cultural symbols were chosen carefully. Harley-Davidson saw its European sales drop 30% in 2024 alone, with projected losses of $145 million by the third quarter of 2025. Farmers were hit harder. U.S. agricultural exports to Europe plunged over $23 billion. Wisconsin's Land O'Lakes Dairy Co-op reported immediate pain from cheese and butter tariffs. What was sold as protectionism has exposed deep domestic weaknesses. Meanwhile, Canada quietly filled the gap. Under the EU-Canada Trade Pact, nearly all tariffs were eliminated, creating a seamless trade corridor projected to reach €90 billion annually by 2026. As U.S. steel and auto prices climbed, European companies pivoted north. Siemens and Alstom redirected supply lines to Quebec and Ontario. Canadian cleantech exports to Europe soared 41% year over year, fueled by a €1.22 billion hydrogen deal. Canada is no longer just Washington's neighbor, it's becoming Washington's replacement. The EU's REPower initiative commits to producing 20 million tons of renewable hydrogen annually by 2030. Enough to cut nearly €60 billion in fossil fuel imports. A joint summit between Brussels and Vancouver forged deals on solar standards, AI-driven power grids, and rare earth supply chains. While Washington reduced climate spending, Canada fully aligned with EU labor and environmental rules. The result: stable energy partnerships, resilient supply routes, and a European strategy designed for independence. If Ryanair abandons its Boeing deal, the implications go far beyond lost sales. It would open the door for Chinese jets in Western fleets. COMAC's entry wouldn't just validate its tech, it would dilute the FAA's role in setting global aviation rules. Airbus may dominate now, but a COMAC breakthrough would shift certification power. This isn't just about plane makers, it's about who writes the rule book for the skies. If Washington loses that influence, it may never get it back. Brussels is now replicating the EU-Canada model worldwide. Since 2023, it has launched 17 trade talks across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. These deals offer tariff-free access in exchange for digital cooperation, labor alignment, and infrastructure investment. In 2024, the EU finalized a $3.4 billion supply chain pact with India, outside U.S. systems, and settled in non-dollar terms. These aren't temporary countermeasures. They are structural replacements for systems America once controlled. Europe's retaliation is no longer hypothetical. A $95 billion tariff package is set to activate by mid-July. EU officials are clear: without a U.S. policy shift, tariffs are coming. While Washington plays down the crisis, Europe moves forward. Airbus stock rose 3.7%, Canadian steel exports to the EU jumped 24% in the first quarter, and 7 new EU trade deals are being fast-tracked, none including the US. The Western trade order isn't collapsing, it's being rebuilt without Washington. What began with tariffs has triggered a wave of new alliances. Boeing's troubles, COMAC's rise, Canada's elevation, and Europe's global deals all point to one fact: the balance of power is shifting. Washington thought tariffs would force compromise. Instead, they sparked reinvention. With $2 trillion in trade on the line, the real question is, who sets the rules of the next economy? This isn't noisy diplomacy. It's a silent restructuring. As U.S. officials argue over tariff levels, Brussels is cementing new standards and trade norms. Each signed agreement, each rerouted shipment, and each frozen contract represents a deliberate shift. Europe isn't threatening decoupling. It's already happening. The U.S. expected resistance. What it got instead was substitution. For decades, America's leverage came from stability. But leverage without reliability becomes a risk. As Europe builds new partnerships with Canada, India, and the Gulf, reliance on U.S. systems starts to look less like necessity and more like liability. Tariffs meant to protect U.S. industries are pushing partners to bypass Washington entirely. The long-term cost strategic isolation. This is bigger than economics, it's geopolitical. By embedding trade within digital, climate, and technology agreements, Europe is turning supply chains into alliances. Nations once dependent on U.S. digital infrastructure are now signing with the EU, accepting its AI rules, data laws, and rare earth strategies. These aren't just trade deals, they're influence corridors. While the U.S. chases short-term wins, Europe is building long-term frameworks and interoperability without asking Washington's approval. The fallout is already visible. Boeing is just the start. U.S. agriculture, autos, and tech are under mounting strain as partners diversify suppliers. Losing tariff-free access to the EU, once America's top trading partner, means shrinking market share. What was promised as security is becoming contraction. Global trade is being redrawn. The transatlantic axis is no longer the center. A new triangle is forming, linking Europe and Asia through connected trade and tech partnerships. Washington miscalculated. Instead of reinforcing old alliances, tariffs accelerated new ones. And each new deal that excludes America makes the shift harder to reverse. Europe isn't clinging to the past, it's engineering its future. Clean hydrogen, batteries, digital infrastructure, and semiconductors are the pillars of its next industrial era. This transition is funded through coordinated EU strategies, executed through multilateral deals, and aligned with global partners outside the U.S. dependency on American agriculture, aerospace, and arbitration is being dismantled step by step. Each new contract reduces exposure to U.S. volatility. This isn't a reaction, it's Europe redefining sovereignty. The 50% tariffs were meant to create movement. Instead, they forced decisions. Ryanair reconsidering Boeing, EU food imports shifting to Latin America, clean tech investment moving to Canada, semiconductor ties pivoting to India, all add up to more than trade realignment. They mark a reset of priorities and partners. In seeking dominance, Washington triggered events that could permanently weaken its global role. The unraveling isn't dramatic, it's deliberate. Not declared in speeches, but visible in contracts, shipping routes, and policy frameworks. The transatlantic alliance is no longer the anchor it once was. In its place, a wider, multipolar network is rising. Where Europe negotiates without American oversight, Canada becomes a trade hub, and influence is shared, not dictated. The age of automatic U.S. leadership in global trade is ending, not with collapse, but with quiet replacement. Europe isn't waiting for Washington to adjust course, it's building its own. Canada isn't just filling a gap, it's stepping forward. China isn't waiting at the door, it's already inside. The tariff era was meant to strengthen America's hand. Instead, it risks leaving the U.S. on the sidelines, reading rules written elsewhere. In Washington, many believe trade ties can be quickly repaired, but markets don't wait. Once contracts shift, infrastructure is built, and policies are locked in, the path back narrows. Europe isn't just reacting to this administration, it's future-proofing against the next one. On paper, things may look reversible. In practice, long-term deals and rerouted supply chains make them permanent. For decades, U.S.-EU trade rested on shared history and mutual interest. Today, Europe's strategy is driven less by loyalty and more by leverage. Industrial sovereignty, domestic production, independent supply chains, and diversified partners is now the guiding principle. Brussels isn't waiting for inclusion. It's shaping outcomes on its own. The alliance may remain in defense and diplomacy, but in trade, the split is already underway. Boeing's threatened deal with Ryanair is more than a contract at risk. It's a symbol. A symbol of how even iconic American industries can be sidelined when trust erodes. Once the default supplier in Europe, Boeing now represents uncertainty, not due to engineering flaws, but policy choices. If the biggest U.S. aerospace firm can be displaced this fast, what message does that send to agriculture, autos, or tech? Lost contracts hurt, but lost confidence hurts more. Europe's approach isn't about revenge, it's about replacement. Where U.S. tariffs created instability, Brussels found alternatives. Latin American farms, Canadian steel, Chinese electronics, Indian chips. This isn't tactical, it's structural. The goal isn't punishment, but resilience. Each new trade partner reduces risk. What Washington sees as temporary maneuvering, Brussels views as permanent redesign. The EU-Canada Trade Pact has become a blueprint, tariff-free, labor-aligned, climate-integrated, and digital-ready. Its success has encouraged Brussels to export the model globally. From Nairobi to New Delhi, negotiations now start from this template. The EU is building a network of reliable partners based on predictability and regulation, two things missing under U.S. tariff volatility. It's no longer about excluding America. It's about no longer depending on it. COMAC's rise wasn't fueled by publicity. It was timing. With Boeing weakened and Airbus at capacity, COMAC became a third option exactly when Europe needed one. If Ryanair proceeds with Chinese planes, the shock won't just be economic. It would mark the first real breach in Western aviation exclusivity. FAA rules would no longer be the only global standard. Chinese certifications would start to compete. Once unthinkable, this scenario is now close to reality, all triggered by one tariff too far. While Brussels signed new trade deals, Washington stayed focused on punishment. The assumption was that pressure would pull allies back. Instead, it pushed them away. That's the blind spot. Thinking leverage alone guarantees loyalty. In a world with alternatives, leverage without stability drives abandonment. The silence from Washington as contracts shifted and alliances reshaped wasn't just miscalculation. It was surrender by omission. Power in this century isn't only GDP or military. It's who writes the rules on climate, data, energy, and trade. Europe is stepping up. Canada is stepping in. China is positioning itself. The U.S., once the author of global frameworks, now risks becoming a reluctant follower. This isn't the end of U.S. power, but it may be the end of U.S. trade leadership. The world is still moving forward, just no longer orbiting Washington. Ryanair considering COMAC, Europe sourcing food from Brazil, hydrogen partnerships shifting to Canada. Together they form a new global economy, built not through conflict but construction, not through speeches but supply chains, and each rerouted shipment shows the same truth. The world no longer waits for U.S. permission. Tariffs aren't leverage anymore. They've become invitations for partners to look elsewhere. What began as a political gesture has turned into a geopolitical detour, and that detour is now being built at scale. The $2 trillion at stake hasn't disappeared, it's being redirected, rewritten, and reallocated. What Washington called strategy, the world read as instability. And so, they moved. The real question is whether the United States has just stepped out of the future of global trade. Because this isn't about retaliation or rhetoric anymore. It's about who sets the rules and who ends up watching from the sidelines as those rules are rewritten. Europe's shift away from Washington isn't just a European development, it's a global signal. Nations that long relied on the transatlantic model are now rethinking their own strategies. From Southeast Asia to South America, governments are watching how Brussels forges new trade systems without relying on confrontation. They're seeing that access to major markets no longer depends on aligning with the White House. As Europe expands its infrastructure and digital agreements worldwide, other nations are lining up, not only for trade, but for an alternative framework of rules, values, and standards that bypass Washington. The 50% tariff was never just about steel or cars. It became a turning point, confirming what many allies feared, that U.S. trade policy could no longer be trusted as stable, bipartisan, or rules-based. Earlier disputes had boundaries. This one did not. The message to partners was unmistakable. Agreements could be scrapped overnight and leverage used at will. That realization reshaped thinking across capitals worldwide. If Europe wasn't safe, then no one was. And so, the push toward redundancy, self-reliance, and new alliances accelerated. Today, Redundancy has become the guiding principle of global trade. No major economy wants to depend on a single partner, least of all one capable of weaponizing policy. Europe's new trade deals now bake in backup systems, multiple supply routes, diversified sourcing, flexible logistics. Japan and even rising economies like Vietnam are being woven into this framework. The goal is clear: never again let any one country, including the United States, destabilize Europe's trade balance. Not long ago, America was seen as the anchor of the global economy. Now it's treated as a variable, and that change in perception may be the most damaging of all. Contracts are drafted with the expectation of future unpredictability from Washington. Insurance costs rise, contingency clauses multiply, and dispute settlements are moved outside U.S. jurisdiction. Trust is now conditional. And in international commerce, conditional trust is a red flag for investors, negotiators, and governments alike. Trade agreements of the past were transactional, tariffs lowered, quotas bargained, goods exchanged. Europe's new agreements are transformational. They blend trade with climate commitments, AI governance, and labor protections into one package. They're not just about market access, but about aligning systems, and that makes them harder to exit. Once a nation signs these comprehensive deals with Brussels, returning to a transactional model with Washington becomes less appealing and in some cases impossible. While tariffs dominate headlines, Europe has leaned on something far more subtle yet powerful: predictability. In a fractured world, predictability has become a kind of currency. Brussels provides a stable rulebook, long-term regulatory alignment, and consistent enforcement. For companies planning 10 or 20-year investments, that matters more than temporary tax breaks or political theatrics. As Washington swings between trade policies, Europe is becoming the preferred long-horizon partner. In global markets, reputation isn't just image, it's leverage. American companies now find themselves trapped. At home, tariffs make raw materials more expensive. Abroad, lost contracts shrink revenue. Firms that once built entire divisions around exports to Europe are rethinking their strategies. Some are even exploring moving production to Canada or Europe just to restore access. The irony is striking. Policies designed to protect U.S. industry are now motivating companies to leave. Trade depends on certainty. When certainty breaks, markets adjust. The sudden rollout of massive tariffs shattered expectations of policy stability. No treaty seemed secure. No deal felt guaranteed. Allies turned inward, institutions rewrote forecasts, and banks shifted portfolios. The result wasn't just a pause in trade, it was a complete recalibration of risk. For the first time in decades, global planners now assume that the United States might not be a reliable partner, even in peacetime, even with allies. And just as nature despises a vacuum, so does trade. As Washington stepped back, others filled the space. Europe with regulatory diplomacy, Canada with stable access, China with scale and pricing, India with infrastructure. What once looked like scattered alternatives now appears as a connected web of options. No single one replaces the United States, but together they reduce global reliance on it. And once that web is fully built, the incentive to return to old models disappears. This is not a story of sudden collapse. It's one of gradual replacement. The United States hasn't lost its position in one stroke, but through countless small missteps and shocks. The trading system is entering a new era, defined not by one superpower, but by coalitions, not by coercion, but coordination, not by dominance, but design. In this new order, leadership doesn't go to the loudest actor, but to the one others trust to stay consistent. Right now, that's not Washington, it's Brussels. Thank you for watching. If you found this video helpful, please consider subscribing for more content like this.